I think I will start now. Hi, everybody. It is my pleasure to have Irina Tomescu-Dubrow and Ilona Wismulek as presenters in this webinar. Just a minute, I will share my screen and introduce these fantastic women. Here.
That I like.
So Irina is a professor of sociology at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, Polish Academy of Science, where she currently heads the Graduate School for Social Science, GSSR. She is co-PI on the SDR project, for those who don't know, Survey Data Recycling Project, and was co-PI on the Polish National Science Center grant on ex-post harmonization, measurement, comparability, and multi-level modeling of cross-national survey data. She's also working right now on a book on harmonization. Excuse me. Ilona Wismulek is an assistant professor in the research group Comparative Analysis of Social Inequality at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, Polish Academy of Science. Ilona has been working in the SDR project since 2013, supervising ex-post harmonization work on over 3,000 national surveys of 23 international projects. So as you see, they both live in Poland right now. Ilona coming from Ukraine and Irina from Romania. So this is WAPOR. And now they will start. Irina will start first, and we're going to speak about data recycling and harmonization. Irina, go, go, go.
Okay, thank you. I'm talking here with Ilona, which is always nice to pair as a team. And we want to share our experience with survey data recycling and harmonization. And I'm saying our because while we are only two of us here, we draw on the collaboration of researchers at the Polish Academy of Sciences and the Ohio State University. And it is this collaboration that actually drives the survey data recycling project. Since harmonization, and by this we mean individual level characteristics collected via surveys, is at the root of our work in the SDR project, I will start with this concept. And I will first say that it easily would warrant a course in itself. But in condensed form, we can say that we deal with a body of methods for achieving or strengthening comparability. And here we have to think that it's concepts and constructs, representation, measurement, and we deal with surveys that are fielded in different cultures and or over time, which means that both data providers and consumers of surveys will use some of these methods if creating data infrastructure for comparative research is on our agenda. And generally, we do so at different stages of the survey life cycle. To collect comparable information, data producers apply ex-ante input and output harmonization. And we will briefly say that input harmonization are the steps taken before fieldwork to make the survey conditions across the studied populations as close to identical as possible and thus minimize the share of methodological artifacts in results. And we can speak here of having the same definitions of concepts and the same measurement instruments, same survey methodology. Basically, it's a lot of restrictions and a lot of uniformization. With ex-ante output harmonization, it gets a little bit more relaxed. These are the steps that are taken after the data are in. And these steps involve recording variables that measure a common concept, but do so with country-specific items using a predefined harmonization schema. And a good example to think of are the ESED education measures in ESS, which are derived from country-specific education variables. Secondary users, and we in the SDR project among them, apply harmonization methods ex post. Why? Because we want to take data sets already released that are not comparative by design and play with them. Okay, why we want to do that? Well, we want to go from good to better in terms of data infrastructure for comparative research. And what we want to do is to integrate information from different surveys into a new database that has a broader coverage in terms of time and space and people than the parts that build it. Which poses the question, okay, how do we know what's good and how do we know what's better for comparative analysis? Now, there are project-specific answers, but there are general answers. And first and crucial is we have theory. Which relationships we plan to study and what are the hypothesized mechanisms between these relations inform the decision of, first, do we need even ex post harmonization? And if we decide we do need harmonization, then which data to consider for harmonization? So theory, there's no way around without it. But there is a second pool of considerations, and these are pragmatic ones. The work we set out to do must be feasible given the resources that we have. So let's see what constitutes good in the SDR project. And as we were saying, the first thing is theory. So what substantively the SDR project wants to do is to analyze cross-nationally and over time micro-macro relations in three main areas. And these are democracy and political participation, social capital and political participation, and social capital and well-being. So good, it means that we will have cross-national survey projects. They have already harmonized ex-ante measures on these substantive concepts that we're interested in, of course, also on their correlates. And they would cover sufficient observation points, meaning countries and years, so that we have variation in democracy, in economic development, among others, which would allow us to formulate and examine the micro-macro relations. In other words, how context matters. And there are quite a bunch of international projects. This is not exhaustive list that provide indicators for at least one of the in at least one of the substantive areas that we want to do research in. But we say they are only good. Why are we saying that they are only good? We say they are only good because even in the World Value Survey or in ISSP, coverage of countries in different stages of democratization and economic development is limited. And this holds not only for regions that we know historically are not included and systematically in surveys, but even for Europe, if we think fine-grade former Yugoslav republics and anything beyond Romania farther east. So what this means is that we can't properly measure contextual properties that we know according to theory that we should take into consideration. Why? Because they influence how we behave and how we think and what attitudes we have. So therefore, we decided, okay, if this is good, let's see what it means for us better, again, in the context of the relationships that we want to study substantively. And by better, we decided that we would want these surveys, which are very nice because, again, they have harmonized ex ante many of the concepts that we're interested in, but we want as better data infrastructure that pulls information from these 23 international projects and their correlates so that coverage of people, time, and countries is broader. And what is essential, and in a sense, this would shape most of our work from now on, what is essential, respondents' answers that we pull from the different national surveys of these projects are comparable. This latter requirement and concerns with the finishing work within our lifetime inform next to theory how we decide to choose what to consider for harmonization and what to leave. Know what we need. Pragmatically, the decisions have to be to set boundaries to what we take. And to set boundaries to what we take, we have helped ourselves with a set of criteria that the projects that we work with meet. And this is also important, and we will come back to it in the harmonization workflow. We have set a date after which no new data or documentation would be downloaded for harmonization consideration. And that means that after going through this exercise of combining theory and practical reasons, we end up with data that span 1966 to 2017, that cover in total, because it will not be for the entire period, right? In total, 156 countries, about 4.5 million respondents, and that we know we have to work with about 3,300 national surveys that are embedded or hosted or nested, however you want to call it, into 214 data files. So in a sense, this gives you a sense of what is the backbone for the database that we work on in order to create a harmonized data set that can be used as one single data set. But okay, we have this data and we want to harmonize them, and we need to think that it is an opportunity, but there are also difficulties that we have to be aware from the very beginning about what reprocessing the survey data involves. And I will summarize them along 3 main points or challenges that we have to deal with. The first is to identify in the data that we took and that we want to reprocess, what are the biases and the errors that come from the fact that these national surveys of the 23 projects deviate to different extents from common standards of documentation and data processing. We also face the issue, still within the broader category of methodological biases and errors, that questions that seemingly were the same, actually at closer look, are not quite the same. For example, the scale properties may differ, although the wording is it's pretty much the same. The answer options differ. And then actually that harmonization itself may introduce additional errors, for example, in the process in which we stack the data. So this is one, methodological biases and errors are one broad thing that we need to be aware of and think how to deal with them. A second issue is information loss. How do we minimize information loss? Why to bother with this? Well, we know that oftentimes the criticism that is leveled against ex post harmonization is that it reduces the data to the lowest common denominator, and we end up not doing anything good because we lose the variation and the variance that variables within nations capture when we create the common target variable. And then the third issue, which is clearly related to the others also, is how to ensure transparency. And by transparency, we have in mind how detailed and in what formats should we document what we do, so that we facilitate external checks, we facilitate replication on harmonized datasets, but also we can check off some of our own work. So it's not only towards others, but also to us internally. So these are challenges, no doubt, but fortunately we are not stuck in challenges, otherwise it would be rather bleak. We went to find solutions, and for us these solutions came in the form of methodology and on developing methodology. And we bring here in this concept of the Fdr Analytics Framework, where basically what we try to do in it is to integrate the understanding of ex post harmonization methods, so that we take the classic definition in the literature, and I refer to it, I will not read it since it doesn't make sense, but what we generally know the literature to mean by ex post harmonization, and to add to it the notion that we also need methods to define and measure inter-survey methodological differences that stem from differences in the quality of the source surveys and the ex post harmonization process itself. Why is that? Well, because we can think that the variability that stems from this kind of issues may weaken the validity and the reliability of the harmonized variable, and thus the comparability that actually ex post harmonization wants to achieve to begin with. And this approach of thinking about harmonization, both in terms of creating the target variable, but also in terms of storing basically metadata as methodological variables, informs the structure and the content of the SDR database. Regarding content, with structure we will not deal here today. The SDR database provides substantive variables, it provides harmonized variables, substantive and technical variables, and it provides the two sets of methodological indicators, one that deals with the harmonization process and the other one that tries to capture variation in the quality of the source data. What we want to say here, and Ilona will talk about the variables as she goes through the workflow in SDR, is what I would like to point out here is that actually by taking this kind of approach that we want target variables and we want control variables for various properties of the source data and of the harmonization, we are recycling the survey data, the existing survey data, into forms. The first one is the one that is common in ex post harmonization for most ex post harmonization projects, namely that we are repurposing the information from the 23 projects that we took so that these data can be used for new analysis. Again, and this is common to ex post harmonization in general. In the second form, which the SDR project advances, recycling involves precisely this storing of source survey and harmonization process metadata. And why we are thinking about this as recycling? Because it increases research flexibility. Scholars can check the extent to which data sets or items that depart from certain standards certain standards that the methodological literature poses may or may not impact their results. They may decide to do the analysis on subsets of the data if they can filter by these variables. But importantly, we can also start investigating what it means to include properties of the source data and properties of the harmonization process in statistical models. Can we parcel out the effects of this kind of methodological variables on substantive results? Now that we presented the logic behind the SDR framework, Ilona will talk about workflow in SDR.
Thank you. I will share with you the slides in a minute, but I want first to tell you the main idea and the reason behind the second part of our presentation today. So Irina presented to you already the idea of what is survey data harmonization and how in SDR we see methodology, how we approach harmonization methodology. So also presenting a little bit the challenges and why to harmonize at all. In my part, I will concentrate on the how-to, on the practical aspects of what harmonization involves step by step. Now, when we entered the field of harmonization, which is about 10 years ago or so, the answer to the question why to harmonize seemed to be a little bit more obvious than the answer to the question how to do so. There were some works available, but it still was a little bit like in the fog. We had to discuss a lot and develop our own understanding of what exactly in smaller steps harmonization involves. So in the course of our work, and I want to underline here that many harmonization projects are probably not so large scale. We deal here with 23 international projects, which is a large scale harmonization. And in the course of our large scale harmonization, we gained a better understanding of crucial steps that harmonization involves. And to organize our work as effectively as it's possible and to ensure transparency, we found it useful to discuss and divide the task of harmonization of variables into smaller steps, which we discussed and revised in the team. And I think that it took us for about, I don't know, 4 years of going back and forth and revising the good understanding of these steps themselves. We keep at this point organizing our work around these steps, and in harmonization team, they help us to introduce some new team members, to coordinate parallel work on harmonization of different target concepts, but also to gain a bit of clarity of the progress of harmonization as we go. And we call this the SDR harmonization workflow or harmonization lifecycle. It seems to us that it's very important to openly and critically discuss harmonization workflow beyond our team. And it can be useful for those researchers who aim to enter the field, although each workflow should and is probably tailored to specific project goals. It seems to us that some aspect of our SDR harmonization lifecycle can be used as guidelines, inspiration, or at least as a starting point in other projects, so that same things are not repeated again and again, and same mistakes are not made, to learn from things that are done. At the same time, we think that for those who do not aim to create own harmonization dataset, but want to use our harmonization file, we want to ensure, as Irina already underlined, as good understanding of what we did as possible. So as secondary data users ourselves, we pay a special attention to transparency and of the work process and of documentation as much as possible by providing detailed documentation of target variables and by being transparent about steps that took to harmonize them. So after this reasoning behind this talk about the harmonization lifecycle, let me share with you the screen where I will present to you our current version of the harmonization workflow. Here you see a graph that reminds me a little bit of the recycling sign and reminds Irina a bagel. This graph has 6 steps. Of course, this is simplification. These steps interconnect. But again, I underline to you that in our own work, we use the steps to understand where we are at and to coordinate work. So we find them useful as they are. So step 1, this is something that we call theory. Step 1 involves the, I'm sorry, I have the last slide now, not the first one. Let me show you once again. So in theory, what the main aim of this step, very briefly, is to outline the theoretical models and concepts and to define the criteria for data selection. I will go in a minute with you and walk you through the steps in more detail, but first let me give you the whole full picture and introduce them step by step. So step 2, after a crucial theory part, is the source check. So we have some intentions in mind of what data we want and what concepts we want to test our theories and to answer our research questions. But then we go back to, we go to sources and see what is available. So systematic availability check, and first, and here I want to underline, quite inclusive in terms of operationalization, selection of sources, of possible questions that can be used to create harmonized target variable. Step 3 is define target. And this is usually the interplay between our intention formulated based on theory and availability that we see in source. So very often, based on what is out there, we come back to discussing and redefining how extended or stretched our concept, target concept we want to be. And also it results into the final list of source variable that we use in order to create these target variables or broadly target concepts. Now, step 4, a special attention perhaps, because in SDR, it seems that this has been, it is something that is new, that is we find important and useful. this control variables idea was presented briefly by Irina, saying that we have divided control variables or variables capturing different qualities of items, of harmonized items and the process of harmonization, but also variables capturing different source quality of source materials. So during this step, we come to discuss, think in terms of this variability in how questions are asked, for example, or how response categories appear in source data. What of this variability we find that can be consequential? What out of the process that we introduce by harmonization? Do we do any transformations that we think can be consequential? And perhaps we do it in some set of the data, but not the other. So all this type of information in SDR, we propose to code in terms of control variables to keep transparency and also the possibility to later use it in various ways during the analysis form. And also at this step, we come back to critical analysis of the quality of the sources that we use, how we understand source quality control variables. I will get back when presenting step 4 in more details. Now, after we have already quite a good understanding of what we want in terms of the target and what we have in terms of the sources, we finally go to something that perhaps very often is associated in minds as harmonization itself. This is the mapping, the recode of values from source to target. In the end of the day, these transformations that we do to the values, they are also leading to harmonization since for the harmonized data set. Now, final data set in SDR, but perhaps in a few other projects that deal with harmonization, we find it important to think of the final data set as not one file, but file that can be accompanied with series of plugs, and for example, on different levels of analysis. This main file in SDR includes individual level data. So answers stemming from respondents, and these answers are harmonized throughout of this harmonization workflow. But also this final data set is accompanied by various files which store information about source quality checks or about country level indicators that we wish to later use in, for example, multi-level analysis. Now, this is on the dataset part. Of course, again and again, today we will underline to you the importance of documentation. So in this step 6, the major part of work is on standardizing the documentation that we have been, documentation on harmonization, so that we create during the process for others to be able to understand, trace, and flexibly adjust to own needs what has been done. And documentation is created throughout of the process from step 1 up to step 6. In step 6, we mean like final standardization across documents created, because this is a creative process. And as for any of you doing research, you know very well that steps very often, they are interconnected, and one decision in step impacts the previous and further decisions made. So this is the finalized step, which also includes the idea of how to make it most user-friendly. And with this idea in mind, we will also discuss with you briefly the SDR portal and dissemination idea of how to present already harmonized product, in a sense, the harmonized data set. So 6 steps, I will go now into details into each of them, starting from theory. The aim and how we see it's important not to get lost in the variety of possibilities that harmonization of already collected data gives. the very important first step is a close attention to what we want to have in terms of theoretical models and concepts and hypotheses. So a good work so that harmonization project is theory driven can save a lot of time in the later stages. It is good to go through or write up the list of variables and how they stem out from this theoretical model that we want to test. And then also, after we have already the idea that this is the theory that we want to test and this is the research questions that we're interested in, so our whole project will lead to harmonizing these exact concepts. After this list is created, another thing we find important, but probably is not so upfront right away, is to have a close look into how each of the concepts we identified has been operationalized in different studies. So what are different theoretical possibilities of how narrow or how extended the concept could be? You could use this idea of concept stretch. So how much you could stretch your concept still to meet your research goals. Now, this is all the theoretical discussion before you even look at the data. Another chunk of this theoretical discussion is narrowing down in terms of the area and the time you want to include in your analysis. So basically setting up the criteria of what sources you look for, what countries, what regions, what cultures you want to cover. Do you intend to conduct analysis on certain time frame? I mean, how far you go with this time frame? These are one of those decisions that we think are crucial to make and not really to go back to in terms of time effectiveness. They're consequential for each other steps, and it's good to be as final as possible with these decisions. Now, a little bit in other words, and stemming from our own experience with harmonization, what exactly this step one, a theoretically based harmonization approach means in practice? Well, first, as I already said, we create a desired list of variables for harmonization. We call such harmonization variables target variables. It will appear again and again within the presentation. Now, again, to underline that we advocate for remaining critical and open-minded to different operationalizations of the same theoretical target concepts. It's good to have it in mind before you face the questionnaire with many questions, because you need to be selective and not to omit something. Now, when we work in in harmonization team and sometimes have this intercoder check asking for two different research assistants to look through the same questionnaire and to capture questions that relate to the same concept, we found that the idea behind how the concept should be operationalized can be very different. If it's not theoretically based, very often you could omit some important but already available information just because of not being that open-minded or not knowing about different ways how different concepts could have been measured in existing data. So it is important to make this theoretical overview first before you go and see the source data. Then again, as I underlined in aims, deciding on geographical and temporal limits, thinking of other criteria you might have for survey project selections. As Irina said, one of the way to go about it is quite pragmatic. For example, we decided that we look only in English, in the surveys that have English documentation. Such thing is already an important criteria and imposes some decisions that are made when selecting surveys. But also in some other harmonization projects we co-work with, criteria we see could be very methodological. For example, do you intend to include panel surveys, or do you concentrate on panel surveys or not? Or do you concentrate on cross-sectional surveys only? These are all decisions to be made on this initial step when you narrow down what you're looking for. And as the result of this step is something that we call time zero. Time zero is the time when you decide to download data and documentation. From our experience, it seems to us now crucial for transparency reason to document very openly the date and the name of the document downloaded, because some of the surveys are, of course, ongoing, and they may be changing some things or updating or publishing erratas to keep track of what is going on and to make the best use of available data, but also to be as updated as possible as to what information you're using. It is important to make a little trace for yourself as to when exactly and from what source you downloaded the data. That was step 1 out of 6. Now, after you have this good theoretical, what is out there, it's time to see what is the content in questionnaires and code books of the surveys that you selected. What is out of practical implications? In our project, we found it important and useful to check all available data sources, as many as possible. I mean, documentation sources corresponding to one data file. As part of the SDR project, we were doing the processing error checks, sometimes also just to understand as good as you can the source data you're dealing with or source variable you're dealing with. Some pieces of information can appear in one piece of documentation and another piece of information can be spread out in the other. As you well know, there is no standardization as of today. What exactly international surveys mean by code books? The amount of information included in code books varies very much. So we found it important to look on all available documentation sources to collect information about our intended target concepts and that would lead to target variables. Also, we basically analyze like questionnaires, mainly questionnaires, code books, and data dictionaries. So sometimes data dictionary can include very developed labels and variable names. So any information that stems from the data file, source data file itself, we found important. At this point, this is when you can think of or create the list of keywords that you think correspond to your target. To give you a practical example, for example, when doing the research on corruption, you could think of if you're interested only in bribe giving or also in favoritism and nepotism. So again, back to the stretch of the concept or narrowing down of the concept, how much you see this concept being corresponding to what you're looking for. This is important to be done in advance so that you do not go back to the files that you already revised. Again, perhaps it seems obvious in the research process. It's sometimes like when you revise 3,000 questionnaires and on 1,025, you find a definition of corruption that includes suddenly nepotism. And you think that, oh, I didn't include it in previous, for example, search terms, but it makes sense. So sometimes you can go back and see this 1,000 that you already revised in order to double check if you didn't omit some aspect of your concept that you think makes sense to include. So we discuss this openly in order for you to be as well prepared as possible and to think very carefully on the boundaries of your concept in ahead in terms of keywords as well. Now, another aspect is that already when you go through sources, this is a time to conceptually think of what aspects of source data quality you think may be consequential and important for your analysis. You will have at this step the close understanding of what source materials are out there. You could also at this step think already about conceptually about what control variables in terms of survey data quality you want to later on include. So this is step 2. Step 2 was all about sources. Step 1 was all about theory. Now step 3 is coming back to the main idea, to the main drive of what we, in step 2 source check, I have one more slide presenting to you what are the tools that we think were useful when doing this systematic check. So first, the tool that we keep using now is something that we call a cotton file. First, we called it a common file. This is the Excel file in which we basically automatically store all of the variables from all of the surveys that are we found it to save a lot of time for the first quick look as to what is available. Just creating such a file in advance. For example, you want to harmonize 5 survey projects and then pulling all the variables in one file. It can be even Word file. Excel, we love Excel for many reasons, but it can be any type of one place, can save you time in terms of the search. Now, as we work in the harmonization project for some time already, this common file become more and more advanced, and that's why we call it Cotton, as it is a little bit of a better version of the common file, because this work at this point for us is automatized so that we exclude as possible human errors. We also thought that because our harmonization project is large scale and we include so many international survey projects, that perhaps this Cotton Excel file with list of all variables through all projects can be used by someone else as well. And we made it available on the Dataverse, and you can also find it through SDR harmonization website, so that anyone who starts a harmonization project and has similar or same set of projects that we use, you could also use this Excel file in order for a quick check of availability of different source variables that you think can be later translated to target. So another document that we already start working on at this step 2 is something that we call detailed variable report. This is also an Excel. But this Excel includes the very first inclusive selected list of source variables that correspond to our target. On this Excel, we spent many team meetings or many discussions, as this first inclusive search usually brings us very upper informative decisions as to how we want to see our target further on. I will now show you the print screen of the Cotton file. Again, just to let you know that this is freely available if you think it can be useful for you. This Cotton file at this point has 88 and something thousand variables and 214 source data files. By source data files, we mean survey wave. In here, you see world value survey 1.6. This is the one data file with 6 integrated waves. Sometimes you will see the surveys like ESS1 only, for example, on the level of 1 year survey wave. And corresponding names of the variables, corresponding variable labels. You see here Google translations from Spanish. This is because we have in our harmonization project America's Barometer. And this is the mixture of documenting things in Spanish and in English. So sometimes we had to help ourselves to understand the labels. But generally, this is all automatically retrieved source information from documentation from these surveys that we have all in one place. This is also with some macros, so that with such large file, the Excel is sometimes not filtering well with the automatic filter function that Excel provides. So we had we worked with computer scientists to create some additional macros and buttons to ensure that when we filter some keyword, we have all of the results. But this is very intuitive to use. If you have basic Excel idea, I'm sure that these filters would be very easy, and maybe it would be useful for some of you as a source. Now I come to something that I already told you, the step 3. Step 3 is the step on which we come again to discuss the target. We already know from theory what we want and from data what is available. This is the time to redefine, rediscuss, and finalize the list of source variables that correspond to target. By list of source variables, I think mainly about, for example, question items. But also I want to underline that sometimes you will find 2 questions corresponding to 1 target. For example, illegal demonstrations and legal demonstrations sometimes are asked in 1 question, sometimes in 2 separate questions. So you might want to be very sensitive towards such differences, and discuss different weaknesses, strengths, and also peculiarities, different differences that you see in sources that you think may be consequential and should be thus captured in harmonization control variables in later stage. So it means in practice redefinition of a target concept. It means in practice discussions. It also means in practice the write-up of the idea of the borders. So what is out from your target concept? And here a practical advice to keep trace of what you put out. In practice, in SDR, we create a separate Excel sheet called leftovers. And as we work, we do not just delete what we now think is not a part of our concept because we narrowed it down, but we move it to leftovers to, again, ensure transparency and to double check again and again if we didn't make any human errors, or if our idea in the process did not change and now we want some part of the operationalization back, for example. So underlining that keep trace of what you leave out is very important as well. On this slide, this is once again a back and forth. I'm telling you about the process, but also about the result of what we have out of this step. This step 3 in our SDR second round of the work resulted into 26 harmonized target variables. So we created detailed variable reports with exact list corresponding to this 26 harmonized target variables. And again, not to repeat too much, but to underline, because the structure of the data set is a little bit complex, that in the end, when you harmonize, you do not only harmonize the conceptual variables of your interest. So if you want to study democratic values and education, for example, and gender, if these are the key elements of your interest, sometimes you think only of them as something to harmonize. But no, you would build up on that. You would need some technical variables, no matter what is your substantive focus. And these technical variables would be most probably including not only project name, year, country, but also weights and how you deal with weights. But also, and this is something that is troublesome in its own and could be a topic of a separate workshop, is that each of the source has a different missing code schema and missing code approach. So you need to be critical and reflective as to not only your substantive focus, but also how you treat this way, how source data treated missing codes. And again, underlining that each of 26 harmonized target variables in SDR is accompanied by a set of control variables that captures specific characteristics of sources to ensure that there is as minimum information loss as possible. So this is all that you decide on step 3. And the conceptual idea of what types of things you want to measure in control variables should happen here, and then move on to step 4. In step 4, you would deal mostly with, you already know your set, your list, your fixed set of sources you want to translate to your target concept. And now it's time to critically reflect what properties of these source questions you think can be consequential in terms of methodology. So control variables, harmonization control variables, they preserve features of the source items, such as, for example, some questions ask about demonstration ever, some questions ask about demonstrating last year. Do you think this is an important element of your questions and it can be consequential later on or not? If you think this is an important feature, important variability, we advocate to keep trace of this and to capture it as a control variable. Now, control variables of harmonization can be also caused by our decisions of how to combine variables or how to harmonize. Today, I already gave you the example of this legal and illegal demonstrations that could be two separate questions. Now, this is our own decision. It's not exactly operationalization, the peculiarity of the question asked, but our decision to combine a few questions in one. Then we want to make trace of how developed this amount of questions was. For example, the questions on membership in organizations. This could be very important, whether this was asked as separate questions or grouped in somehow. We know methodological research that says that it can be consequential. If you know of such methodological research, most probably you want to capture this during your harmonization process in harmonization control variables. Now, control variables, the second type of control variables, deal with survey data quality. And we will not develop it in too much details now unless you want to bring it in the Q&A part of our presentation. But what we mean here is that at this point, this is also a moment to code and to keep trace of what elements of source data quality you think can be important when you analyze your data. In SDR, we developed the schema of what we think is important within the source data quality realm. And we discuss it within three different sections. So we check survey documentation as the indicator of data quality and different aspects stemming from that documentation. For example, response rates, available or not available information about this, or translation, back translation, things like that. But also we have a detailed analysis of the quality of data records. Maybe some of you know the publication on duplicates that we had. So this is along these lines. You analyze the data records, not looking even at documentation at this step. Then something that the team was involved intensively in is the step of comparing the consistency between data and documentation and seeing whether there is any types of processing errors that is out there that you think can be consequential for your analysis of the data. Now, why to do so? It is important to underline that this step is time consuming. It can be seen as the small project in itself if you go in depth of how you understand survey data quality. But why to do so is mainly because we are secondary data users and we need to make the best use of available information in order to best understand what is captured within the source variable that we have, and to see whether some of the variability within survey data quality is consequential or not in the analysis. Now we have two more steps left. We are very close to already finalizing the process. We have already our theory, we have analyzed sources conceptually, we decided on the list of target and what exactly we want. We coded features of the sources that are mapped to target in form of control variables, capturing harmonization control and quality control. mapping of values from source to target. So the recode, in simple terms, it can get a bit more complicated if you, of course, did some transformations or decided to do some transformations that you captured in harmonization controls. But generally and mostly, this is about this step is about mapping source values to target, recoding source values to target. In SDR, we started from a simple Excel file to help later with the syntax. We've seen quite a few projects that just make syntax available, and within the syntax you could see this mapping and recoding. But we found it useful in SDR for the clarity, usability, and transparency to create something that we call a crosswalk table. This is perhaps one of the core elements of our process in terms of the tool. This is, again, a macro-enabled Excel document that is the basis of harmonization syntax, and it stores all of the decisions behind why we coded 1, a value that was 2, for example. What labels are behind this 1 and 2? I will show you the print screen of generally how a part of this document looks like. What you see, this is again an Excel file. It could be with macros. It's comfortable to have this very helpful tool like set up like this, but it could be a simple Excel file if, for example, you're within the harmonization project that doesn't have resources to create the specified tools, or to use this tool wouldn't be comfortable for your own needs. So what is important is that you keep trace of how you recoded in a user-friendly way. Here in column C, you have target labels that correspond to target values. We first started to type that 1 is recoded to 2, but this is very error prone. We are humans and this is error prone. So we found it a bit easier to make less mistakes when we do consistency checks if we code in a separate Excel sheet that miss, for example, corresponds to certain code in our target schema. So we type in words and Excel catches up these words, and we correspond these words to values and to source data labels that are later automatically corresponded to target values. So column C is corresponding to another table that codes it or recodes it to exact target value. Column D has source values. Column E is a key information about source labels. In very brief, the column B has sections. So 3 would be the section of the recode, 1 would be the section of the survey project and variable name, and 2 is the section that just repeats the label for the whole question. This is very brief about crosswalk table. Of course, we again invite more discussion on it if you think it could be useful for your own needs. But this is generally the mapping of source to target. Now the final step. The final step is finalizing the documentation and finalizing the data set. Here I list to you something that we keep saying, that in SDR, we aim for a broader documentation set accompanying each target variable, so that depending on the user, you could get to a more or less detail as to the process of harmonization was done and what exactly is consistent within that harmonized variable. And also there is a separate set of documentation that we have for source data quality controls. The end data file that we have is also, again, underlining something that I said in the beginning. We have master file on respondent level and some plugs on different levels of analysis for wave, for survey, for country, that you could merge with this individual level data later on. We found it most useful and efficient, But also, this is if you want to download it as it is. Irina in a minute will talk to you about the idea behind SDR portal, online portal that we create again with the user in mind, having the idea that harmonization is a complex process and we have a lot of elements in there. Perhaps this SDR user portal could help somehow make some decisions of what you want to use out of the data. So to sum up, on this slide, I will walk you through just briefly about tools and traces for each step of harmonization. We're back at the bagel graph that has all 6 steps. The first step, key decision, key milestone for you is to decide for time 0. So when data and documentation downloaded. In step 2, the key milestone for you is to use as many, you could use the tool of the cotton file and you could create the first detailed variable report inclusive list. In step 3, you finalize detailed variable report and you include already only selected source variables that you want to harmonize into target. In step 4, you develop the detailed variable report by adding control variables and also working on control plugs of quality of source surveys. This would be different documents. Then step 5, we go to another document in SDR. We work on crosswalk table that is informed by detailed variable report with list of variables. And this crosswalk table includes mapping of source to target. And final product is this master file together with different plugs, data user guide that is developed by different of these reports that I told you, and also SDR online portal that Irina would tell you a little bit about in a minute. So to sum up perhaps in a few words, we think SDR, it's important to think and present this workflow as transparently as possible and all the documents that stem out of this workflow to promote transparency, but also for replicability reasons and for flexibility for the user, so that someone could use this data in flexible for own purposes, as flexible as possible. I would give word now to Irina to go on and tell you a little bit more about our SDR online portal.
Okay, what I want to show is not about the portal, but actually I was thinking that as we talked about the SDR, it's very dry in a sense, right? It's a lot of theory and a lot of methodology in trying to convey the logic of what we do and why we do it in a certain way, and hence to maybe show you what are the outcomes. And since Ilona talked of bagel, here I have a donut, at least I think it looks like a donut. And what it shows actually our target variables, and those you see by color. So if I go over it, we see that we measure age, but we also measure birth year. Hence the 2 colors are yellow, but the concept is age. We have civil status, we have gender, we have income, all together but we have to think about how these measures are and what is possible to create and why certain target variables are constructed the way they are. But you see that sometimes we have colors that are the same. Why? Because sometimes we have 2 different target variables for the same concept. So we have, for example, we measure happiness as a scale, an 11-point scale, but we also measure happiness as a distributional variable where people fall within the given national survey, where they fall in relation to a given percentile, who falls at or below them in terms of how happy they report to be. We will not go into the discussion of why we're doing it, but what I want to say is that we have 26 target variables that are corresponding to distinct theoretical concepts, but we have altogether 39 target variables, and sometimes we measure the same concept in different way. I wanted also to stress here that actually for the portal, crucial, the collaboration with the computer science people is there. So we have, I would like to really mention explicitly the help of Yamei and Przemek. Yamei is from OSU, she's a PhD student, and Przemek is our colleague from Warsaw. But also this has, the color schema that you see is informed by our colleague Zuzana Skóra, who is psychologist and who told us, okay, this is how you should use the colors, and she had very good reason why. So one thing that perhaps we said in this presentation, but should be underlined, is if you get people from different disciplines to work together, sometimes it's possible, sometimes less so, but harmonization is really conducive to interdisciplinary work, you may get insights that by ourselves within discipline we wouldn't. Anyway, so these are the different target variables. But then you see that each of these colors has some arcs over it. And the arcs show the harmonization controls. Now we see that some variables have no harmonization controls, like gender. But then there are others, like education, which we measure as both years and categories, that have up 5 or together, right? I mean, jointly they have up to 5 harmonization controls. Here, if I want to search, and I would like to see if we're saying we were talking about, and I think I will go and show in a second, we are saying about civil status. Let's see if I can get it this way. Okay, then only one variable remains, and then we know that, okay, if we want to play, this is still work in process, but if we want to play, these are its controls, then I want to understand, okay, what am I capturing with these controls? And now I can see that, okay, actually for cohabitation, we see that the standard, what we usually call 0, what occurs most frequently or is most characterizing of all the data, is that there is a distinct option for cohabitation, but there is no option for legal cohabitation or partnership. Maybe this would be a little bit more helpful if we can see what is the distribution, how we code the target variable cohabitation. And this leads me back to what Ilona was talking about flexibility and what we mean, how do we not throw out data? And how do we try to keep the data such that others who do not necessarily have the same definition that we have can still use them? So when we did civil status, you know, we could have put married or else, but we realized that, okay, we have the married people, we have the cohabitating people, we have those that are single, we have those that are separated or divorced, and we have widowed, and there is also something called other. I will not go into each definition, but what I try to show by showing you this how we code it here by looking at the answer options is that if we want to allow others to play with this data, we should keep as much information as possible that is meaningful for the definition of civil status. And this is what we tried to do throughout the creation of target variables. Of course, in some instances, it's much simpler. For gender, we have male, female, and other. We can see that 8 people answered other, right? So we are still years ahead. Maybe this will change. So from this point of view, it will be interesting perhaps to see how survey data will look in, I don't know, now or in 10 years from now. We stopped in 2017 in terms of self-identification on the gender dimension. Anyway, this is, so what I wanted actually to show you with regards to the portal is what it means when we say we do all this work in terms of its translating into the target variables and the harmonization controls. There is also information here about the quality controls, but this is not what I would like to talk about now. It takes us too long. Perhaps the other thing that I would like to share, just that we conclude this presentation, is to make with Ilona a couple of comments, and then again maybe acknowledge one more time our colleagues. But basically, this, am I sharing this? This time it's not clear to me at this point. Let's see. Share. Okay. So if we are to wrap this up, in terms of what we are thinking about harmonization, well, we are saying, you know what? We know that it's a buzzword, like now as it was interdisciplinary at some point. And, you know, sometimes you want funding, use certain buzzwords. But we also know that it really is a useful tool. Why? Well, because we haven't invented yet time travel. So if we really want to broaden time coverage and the geographic coverage for decades ago or 5 years ago or 30 years ago, we know very well that retrospective questions and attitudes and opinions suck. I'm sorry, don't work. If we want to broaden the data backwards, harmonization is the way to do it. We wanted to emphasize the role of theory and pragmatism. So this is the certainly to set the boundaries, because you need to finish work within your lifetime. We want to stress that it is crucial to think about how, given how much work goes into harmonization, how do you maximize the research potential of the harmonized data set? And this is why we're thinking promote as flexible a structure of your target and harmonization control variables as possible, and store metadata as variables. It is not that much extra work, but it is a tremendous asset once the data set is constructed for you and for others. And think about the fact that no matter how, I mean, it is a tremendous amount of work, but actually transparency of the harmonization workflow facilitates knowledge accumulation. So if we are to learn from each other, be as transparent as you can and share. You know, this is also part of being, or a crucial part of being of the scientific community. Don't be shy in sharing the work that you're doing. And with this, I would end on the fact that actually we do a lot of harmonization, but what is less done, and there is a lot of space, and if desire is to do research on the methodology to define and assess the quality of data sets constructed via ex post harmonization. So this is, if we're thinking, okay, we have increasingly the tools and funders are willing to support ex post harmonization. Okay, let's start looking, what does it mean that we have data of good quality that were constructed with ex post harmonization? That's it. Thank you. Let's go to questions now.
With my microphone. So hi everybody, thanks a lot for this, Irina and Ilona. I have to say that I follow this work for years, and this last querier thing, I was so impressed. So if anybody has a question, please ask in the Q&A. Yeah, Q&A. In my French, it's Q&A. Hi, Andrew. So I will ask Ilona to answer not by typing, but by saying it. There was a question by Andrew Klassen, who has, as I know of, Andrew also has an harmonized database about democracy, if I remember well. So what was Andrew's question? I don't see it.
I can brief in. The question is about the weights, and if we have already information available of how we treat weights. This is a very good question. Andrew knows the very important and difficult aspect of harmonization, and this is very well, and this is one of them, I guess. So what we have available online at this point, and Irina, correct me please if I'm wrong, is the approach to weights in SDR1, but we are in the making of the documentation of how in SDR2 we approach weights. So I cannot provide you the link as I provided in previous answers to questions with the variable report on how we treat weights. But we could.
It will be available, but it takes a lot of work. So we hope that by September we should have this also. It's a little bit, I mean, generally it follows the logic of what we did in SDR1, but I know that Marcin Zielinski, who works explicitly on weights, changed some things. And then there will be also a chapter that he's preparing, but that's longer. process, but certainly the information on how we deal with weights will be available on the website, but I would think it would be closer to September.
But again, you could check the Dataverse for SDR1 version of the documentation of how we treated weights for now.
Then I have a question by Alejandra Arias Salazar. My question is about variance estimation. Thinking about estimation, how do you go around variance estimation? Could resampling methods such as GRR or Bootstrap work?
Okay, we have not, if I understand correct the question, and this is in relation to checking the quality of the harmonized data, that we can think, okay, how much variance is captured by the national survey variable and how much do you lose in the target variable. We have not done this. But so yes, it is an interesting approach. We have talked to Christoph Wolf actually quite about it, but we have not implemented it.
Okay. I'll just check if there are other questions. Okay. So I do not have, so last call, I do not have other questions. So I encourage everybody to first look at this incredible survey data recycling project on Dataverse. There are other projects out there. I know that Andrew has one. I myself have one on trust, but there are others that I sometimes hear of. I'm in a conference, people say, oh, I have this. And a lot of people, some people do not share it or not because they don't want to share it, but because there are some legal aspects to sharing that we have to be careful about. But usually you can reach out to these people and work with them. And perhaps there should be at one point a session where everybody who does harmonization that harmonized data set come together. So I hope it will happen one day. So now
I see one more question.
You see one more question? Okay. It's not a question.
I answered it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you already answered it.
But maybe it was on panel data harmonization. So in SDR, we do not have panel data, but it was a question by Andrew on panel data harmonization. And in SDR, we do not have panel data, but we independently from harmonization, Irina and I, we also work in Polish panel survey. And recently, a few years ago, there has been the harmonization initiative of a few panel survey, large-scale panel survey data sets in Europe. I've sent the link. I think it's available to everyone, not only to the one who asked the question. We work on close cooperation. This is a separate project, but I think that Irina is in an advisory board. I'm also co-working with this project very much. And they they work on the challenges that this panel specificity raises when harmonizing data.
Okay, thanks. Now, just my last slide, please stay because just before the thank you, next webinar will be on June 16. Eurasia Barometer, a comparative study on social and political attitudes in Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Russia, and Ukraine. So this is going to be extremely interesting. So keep it in your mind, Thursday, June 16 from 9 to 10:30.
I'm so glad we stopped harmonization in 2017 because it would have been no way not to take this data.
So bye everybody. It was very pleasant to have you all, and see you at the next WAPOR webinar. And thanks a lot, Irina and Ilona, for your work. It was absolutely interesting, but I love it. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye, everybody.
Thank you for inviting